Hey everybody, welcome once again to the Winning Digital Customers Show. I am Howard Tiersky, and I want to wish you a very happy Passover if you're celebrating Passover, which just began the night before last. And of course, if you're celebrating Easter, that's coming up next weekend, and I want to wish you a very happy Easter. My family, we celebrate Passover. I've brought my matzah today, so just in case I get hungry during our live cast, I've got a little snack here to have. This is my Passover matzah. And I thought in the spirit of the season, it would be interesting to talk a little bit about the Bible, not from a religious perspective. This is for all denominations, for believers and non-believers, but only because the Bible, I believe, if I was going to give the Bible a subtitle, it would be Stories of Leadership. To me, the Bible is not exclusively, but heavily filled with stories of different characters who are leaders or attempting to be leaders in one way or another. And again, without straying into the realm of really religion or belief, I think it would be safe to say that the Bible, as a series of stories, has been very successful. As a matter of fact, the Bible, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, is the #1 best-selling book of all time. And the most recent statistic I was able to find is as old as 1995. It's pretty darn old. But as of 1995, the Bible was estimated to have sold more than 5 billion copies since it was first printed by, I guess, Gutenberg. And I'm only assuming that number has dramatically increased since 1995. So way better than Harry Potter, right? Way better than Lord of the Rings, or just about anything else that you could probably find. So clearly a book that has touched a lot of people in different ways. And I thought what I would do today is just touch on a few stories that you're probably familiar with in the Bible. My goal here is not to retell the whole story, but to just share with you what I think the lesson is from each of those stories as can be applied to those who are leading companies, leading transformation, leading digital transformation. So I thought that would be fun in the spirit of Passover and Eastover. Did I say Passover and Eastover? Passover and Easter, to take a little bit of look at what we can learn. And by the way, I will tell you that most of my comments are from the world of the Old Testament, since that is my familiarity and knowledge. Anyone who has any additional stories that you want to put in the comments that come from the New Testament or even other religious texts, that is absolutely 100% welcome. I'm simply speaking mostly from the perspective that I've mostly been educated in my own Sunday school and religious observance. Okay, let's dive in. And I'm going to take this in the order that the stories appear in the Bible. And I'm going to start with creation. The Bible actually begins, in the beginning, God created the heaven and earth, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And one of the things that the Bible and the Jewish Hebrew Torah, if you prefer to refer to it that way, it makes clear is that the creation at the beginning is about language. It's about describing something, and God says something should happen, and it happens. Now, I'll grant you that I'm assuming that no one listening is God. I mean, I should probably not say that. I'm assuming God is always listening, but aside from God, who probably doesn't count anyway on our view counts, most of us are not. So of course, the things that we say do not automagically become reality. But in leadership, I do think it's critical that we are able to clearly articulate a vision. While we cannot automatically make things happen with our words, generally the things that happen, especially the good things that happen, the strategic things that happen, begin with a clear articulation. What is the vision? What is the intention? Where are we headed as an organization? And so in that regard, I think that we can take a lesson from this, which is the greatest transformation project ever undertaken, right? The creation of the heaven and the earth from nothing. Because after all, isn't that interesting? The Bible begins with a transformation. It begins transforming nothing into the world, the universe. And it begins the transformation with words. So of course, if you end with words, you may not get anywhere, but words can be a powerful way of inspiring people, of mobilizing people, especially when they are clear. God's words in the story of the Bible are unambiguous. They are very clear about what is to happen. Let there be light. Actually, maybe I should restate that. It's fairly clear. Although I suppose you could argue that the actual execution, the Bible doesn't say, let there be a sun, right? So maybe someone else was left to figure out exactly how to make there be light. And that's good too. When you're communicating as a leader, you want to have clarity about what you want, about what the outcome is. But if you're allowing others to figure out the way to get there, then that can actually be a good way of leading, but giving plenty of room for others to add their own creative contribution, their own creation to what's being done. So that's number one. We can learn from the very, very beginning of the Bible that when you want to transform something, you start with words. Okay, let's move on. Number two, desire. So we all know, of course, the story of Adam and Eve and how Adam and Eve fall from grace from the Garden of Eden because of the serpent and the serpent's suggesting to them that they should eat the apple. And so I think what's interesting as a leader in thinking about this story is God has told Adam and Eve that you can do anything you want, just don't do this one thing, right? Just don't eat from this one tree. And yet, when something is desirous to people, when you create a product like the apple hanging from the tree, and you create a promise around that product, which is to say, if you eat of this apple, you'll have the knowledge of life and death. You'll be taken to a whole other place. You'll have a whole other level of knowledge and awareness. Your life will be transformed. When you create a product that is so desirous, it can be very difficult to tell people not to go. In this case, even God's telling Adam and Eve that they will be killed for eating this apple is not enough to keep them from it. So I think there's a couple of lessons in this story. The first is, let's try to create some products that are that desirable, right? That people really want so much, because there's always some voice in your customer's head telling them not to do the thing you want them to do. You want to sell them a new car. There's a voice in their head saying, I should stick with my other car for you. It'll be more economical. Whatever you want people to do, there's probably some fear holding them back from moving forward. And putting aside for a moment the question of whether it's really in their interest or not in their interest to move forward, in many cases, customers are held back from doing things that would be in their interest. Hiring your company to be their new accounting firm, which would be a great move for them, but they're concerned that for one reason or other, they don't want to make that move. They're worried about something that is holding them back. And this is a story of how a incredibly desirous product helps, or at least empowers, two characters to overcome their fear. And in many cases, that's what you want your customers to do. And furthermore, if you look at the actual story, what happens is when the Bible talks about how desirable this apple is, and the snake says to Eve, you should eat the apple. And she says, no, I can't. God said, if we eat the apple, we will surely die. And the snake basically says, no, you won't die. And she says, oh, okay, great. And she eats the apple, right? In other words, she emotionally wants the apple, and it's quite easy to overcome her rational objections. If somebody has a strong enough emotional desire to do something, that we talk about all the time how people make decisions emotionally and then they simply rationalize them. And this was clearly a rationalized decision by Eve, because after all, the snake has very little credibility, right? God has told her that if she eats the apple, she'll die. And yet, as soon as the snake says, oh, that's not true, she's perfectly willing to buy into that and go ahead and have the apple. So to me, I think that's just a biblical lesson in the fact that people will typically do what it is that they want to do, what they're emotionally engaged to do, which is why it's in all of our interest to try to figure out how to make it what it is that we want our customers to do as emotionally desirable as possible, and then just make sure that somehow we've provided a rationalization so that they can feel that it's okay to take that action and fulfill their desire. Hopefully not in a way that will cause them irreparable harm the way it does for Adam and Eve, but nevertheless, I think there's an interesting lesson to be learned there. Okay, let's move on. Moving on through the Bible, let's talk about Noah's Ark. So Noah has a vision. God speaks to him. He has an inspiration. While most of us are not spoken to by God, at least not in a way that we recognize, I think most leaders have a passion, have a vision, have an inspiration, have something it is that they believe in, a future that they see, that they believe. They're creating a product for a world, for a future world that they think will happen, a need that they feel that they're fulfilling. And the story of Noah to me is one of persistence. Noah gets this idea that there's a flood coming. He needs to build an ark, and he works on this project, the creation of this boat, for, depending on which thing you read, at least 50 years. Some interpretations say he worked on it for over 100 years. Back in those days, in biblical times, sometimes the lengths of people's lives are described in ways that aren't consistent with modern medicine. But in any case, let's just go with the lower estimate of 50 years. He's building this ark in his, his backyard or whatnot. I think he built it on a mountain, if I recall. And people are making fun of him, constantly making fun of him. I mean, it's a pretty nutty thing to do, to build, or seemingly, to build this ark in the middle of nowhere because you believe a flood is coming. And then don't even get me started on the animals, putting all the animals on the ark. This is a story of someone who has a vision, who has an idea, and pursues it not for a week or a month or a year, but for 50 years with the persistent faith that ultimately it will be necessary and this will be the right thing to have done. Now, of course, in the real world, very often we also need to be aware of what's going on around us in the market and pivot and things like that. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you should really work on a product for 50 years, even if there doesn't seem to be a need for it. But as a exaggerated example, as a heroic character that we can look to, as somebody who had a vision and persisted with it, this is actually very often the story behind very successful brands or companies. You hear these stories all the time, whether it's Phil Knight selling shoes out of the back of his car, or it's the Airbnb creators who spent years trying to make this idea successful of kind of a peer-to-peer, rent a room in your house type business online. It was not an immediate success. People said it would never work. They had months and months and years of very limited success, of rejection. And it was only through their persistence, through those dark times and uncertain times, that they were able to become successful. And if you look at almost any great success, whether it's digital one or otherwise, you almost always discover this period of darkness and uncertainty and being told it'll never work. So maybe not 50 years, I'll grant you, like in the Noah story, but I still think that that's an important lesson as a heroic character from the Bible, as somebody who's had a vision and persisted with it, and ultimately, of course, was proved right. And only his family survived the floods, and everybody else was killed because they didn't believe in Noah's vision. Okay, let's move on. Disaster. So I actually talked about this not too long ago, I think in our St. Patrick's Day issue of the show. But if we move, again, we're moving chronologically through the Torah here, through the Bible. And the character of Joseph they're living in Canaan, I guess an area, I guess today, but maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure, Syria or something like that. Anyway, outside of Egypt. And Joseph, who is the son of Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham, right? So this is sort of the patriarchal line, if you're familiar with the story of the Bible, and the patriarchs of Judaism, and ultimately the patriarchs of Islam and Christianity as well. Joseph is disliked by his brothers. He's a bit self-absorbed, a little bit believes great things will come for him. And his brothers get so annoyed by his ego that they sell him into slavery. And so this little cartoon, sorry, it's the best picture I could find of it. Pardon the cartoon nature of it, but basically Joseph's being sold into slavery, and he's taken away from his family, and he's sold to become a slave in Egypt. So just about the most disastrous, horrifying thing that you can imagine could happen to anybody. And to be sold into slavery by your own family. I mean, what a horrible low moment. I mean, God willing, none of us will ever have such a tragedy happen in our lives. And certainly, whatever difficulties we may encounter in business pale in comparison to what happened to Joseph. But what the Bible story shows us is that Joseph, when thrown, and then it gets even worse actually for Joseph, because after he's made a slave in Egypt, he, through no fault of his own, winds up in a situation where he actually gets arrested and thrown into the dungeons of Egypt. And so he's probably going to be executed. He's rotting in a dungeon. I mean, it couldn't be really worse for him. And yet somehow the same skills and abilities that annoyed his brother so much, which were one of his great gifts, was his ability to interpret dreams and to find meaning in things other people didn't see meaning in. And that was one of the things that annoyed his brother so much. He's able to use his skills and ultimately rise up and go from this horrible state where his life is worth nothing to become the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. He winds up rising to, I forget whether he's called prime minister or whatever he is, but he's basically second only to the Pharaoh of Egypt at that time. And he helps not only rule Egypt, but save them from a great famine. So, I think the lesson that I take from this is simply that, sometimes things look bad, right? And it happens in most businesses. I was talking about how businesses go through these dark periods. Sometimes seemingly disastrous things occur. Your company may go into bankruptcy. A competitor may come out with a product that's totally going to destroy you in the marketplace. A lawsuit could get filed that has the potential to destroy your company. Or it could be you personally. Your company could be doing okay, but your initiative, your big digital transformation initiative could face massive resistance. You could get fired. All kinds of things can happen that can seem terrible in the moment. The good news is they're probably not as bad as what happened to Joseph, but even more importantly, we see that story of going from sort of darkness to light, of going from terrible moments to, by using his gifts, by using what he has the ability to do, being able to rise up out of that. So I think to me, that's an inspirational story for anyone in business knows that there are difficult times, there are challenging times, problems occur. And here's a story that reminds us that it's certainly possible to go from terrible times to great ones. All right, moving on. So Moses, there's so much one could say about the character of Moses, and obviously ties closely to this Passover holiday that we're celebrating right now. But I'm just going to pick one moment in the Moses story, which is perhaps the most famous moment. I only say perhaps because there's so many famous moments about Moses, right? Whether it's the burning bush, the plagues with Pharaoh, the 10 commandments, right? So many. But I'm going to pick the moment where he parts the Red Sea. And if you read the actual text of the Bible, and especially if you read some of the commentary, Moses doesn't really know what's going to happen. When you think about what happens in that moment, he has led the Israelites who were slaves in Egypt. He's led them out of Egypt towards Israel, towards the promised land. But obviously he must not have had a good map, right? Because he's heading there and he hits a sea. And meanwhile, behind him, the Pharaoh, the king essentially of Egypt, has changed his mind and has sent his armies racing after the Jews to either kill them or bring them back. And all of a sudden, Moses finds himself in the situation where he's led people to the edge of the water. And meanwhile, there's an army coming toward them to kill them or to re-enslave them. You couldn't really have a more dramatic moment in a movie. And Moses doesn't necessarily have any guarantee. He doesn't necessarily know the full plan in advance. So all he can do is he takes touches his staff towards the water. And of course, what this story tells us is that God parts the ocean and Moses is able to walk through, and all the people walk through behind him. And, all I can say about that is that as this has been my experience too, that sometimes, and it kind of connects with what I was saying about Joseph, which is of course hundreds of years earlier in the Bible where his story occurs. But sometimes you find yourself in a difficult situation when you're leading anything, whether it's a company in general or a transformation. And sometimes all you can do is take it step by step. It's not clear how to solve all the problems. The armies are coming at you from one direction. You've just led all these people. And this is one of the great, what's the right word? The great stresses of being a leader, right? Everyone's following you. And, there's a sort of implicit promise that you're going to take people someplace great. And all of a sudden you find yourself stuck between an army approaching and an ocean on the other side and what to do. And what does Moses do? He simply moves forward without knowing for sure how it's all going to work out okay. He simply moves forward towards the waters, and somehow the waters part for him. Now, my hope is that when you encounter difficulties, the waters will part for you too. And I certainly cannot guarantee that they always will. But in this case, part of the story is they partly part because Moses does move forward. They don't part and then Moses moves forward. Moses moves forward. Moses touches it. He moves towards the water. And as he's moving towards it, the water parts. And so I think that one moment of the story is a lesson to me, which says you just got to keep moving. You just got to keep going forward step by step. And sometimes you don't know what the solution is. And sometimes you feel like you're walking into the den of lions. And if you have a faith that things will work out, you're better off than if you don't have it. And it doesn't mean things will always work out. But that's what I take from this moment in the story of Moses when he parts the Red Sea. Okay, hopefully that's not too philosophical. Moving on, a couple more. So I now want to talk about idolatry in general in the Bible. And so, of course, this is a picture of the golden calf, not the original golden calf. There's no pictures of that. So this is, I don't know exactly what this is, something I found on Shutterstock. But anyway, it's clearly the golden calf. Although actually it looks more like a golden bull. If it has horns like that, maybe it's not a calf anymore. So, well, anyway, it's an idol of some sort. That's for sure. And the reason I put this here is, so, after in the story of the Passover story, after God frees the Israelites and God does the plagues in Egypt, if you know the story, or at least have watched the DreamWorks movie. And then they leave Egypt and God parts the Red Sea. And then they're in the ocean. Then they're in the desert, I mean to say. And God goes to get the 10 Commandments. Man, let me try that again. God parts the Red Sea and they're in the desert and Moses goes to get the 10 Commandments from God. And while they're doing that, they build an idol, the Israelites do, to worship another God, right? They basically do the one thing, just like Adam and Eve, the one thing that they're told not to do, which is to worship another God, another image. And this occurs not only in this part of the story, but it occurs repeatedly. If you read the whole Bible and then you read you read the 5 books of Moses, but then you read what happens after the Israelites go into Israel, the story happens again and again that God is telling them to not worship idols. And they keep doing it. They keep doing it. It's the different, I forget the names of all the different other gods that they erect altars to and they worship. So it's this continuous problem that God is saying, God has given them so much. He's taken them out of slavery. He's made them their own country. He's saved their lives. And he's always asking, it's not the only thing he's asking, but one of the most important things he's asking, it's one of the 10 Commandments, is not to pray to other gods. And yet people do it over and over and over. And so, I think what I take from that, first and foremost, is if you think of the Bible as stories of leadership, one of the leader figures in the Bible, one of the characters, again, not to even get into the question of religion or faith, but just as a story, one of the leaders is God himself or herself, right? God as a figure, God as a character who is telling a group of people what he wants done, sometimes an individual, sometimes a group. And interestingly, God has a lot more success leading individuals than he does groups. Moses does mostly what he asks them to do. Noah does what he asks him to do. Abraham does what he asks him to do. But when he asks the people to do something, very often they don't do it. And whether it's the idol worshiping in the desert, in the story of the golden calf, or even after they get to the land of Israel, after God has delivered 100% on everything he's promised, they're still doing it. And so as a leader, I think the thing you have to recognize is, and that's why I put the word control here, you have limited control. And you cannot expect that humans that are the people that you're leading are going to do everything that you say. It's just not realistic. Obviously, you generally will be creating a vision for what you want done, the direction you want the company to go, the activities that you need everyone to engage in, and you're hoping that everyone will get on board. Know that even when they're on board in many ways, they probably will not be on board 100%. They probably will not do 100% of what you ask them to do. It's just human nature as is taught to us in the Bible. Even God, so the story goes, cannot seem to give instructions that get consistently followed. So have some humility. If God can't do it, then don't beat yourself up if you can't get your whole team to do everything you tell them to do all the time. And know that that doesn't mean that you can't be successful. It doesn't mean that it's not a problem. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do something about it, but just give yourself some solace in the fact that humans are independent creatures, and the ability to actually get everyone to work together and to engage in the things that are for the common good is a great accomplishment as a leader, for you to accomplish as a leader. And don't expect yourself to be able to be successful at it all the time, because, so the story goes, even the all-powerful God is unable to do it in the story of the Bible. I apologize if I'm saying anything that's blasphemous. These are my own interpretations of these stories. Perhaps someone with more religious training would come along and say, no, he could have done it, he just chose not to. I'll leave that to others to say. As far as my reading of the story is, he tried and tried, and he just couldn't get human beings to do what they were asked and told to do. Okay, and the last of these, and then we will wrap it up for this Passover and Easter edition of Winning Digital Customers, is I wanted to talk a little bit about the story of Jesus. Now, I am on dangerous territory here because my knowledge of this story is scant. But I see a couple of themes in this story. Clearly another very powerful story that has touched millions and billions of people and been very, very successful as a story. And I don't mean that in any way disrespectfully. I just mean stories are powerful, and some stories are more powerful than others. And this is one of the most powerful stories in all of humanity. So two things. First of all, the story of Jesus is very much a story of something that I talk about all the time, which is resistance to change. You have a figure who comes up and preaches some ideas that seem good. They seem positive, right? People should love each other, take care of each other, don't judge each other. This hardly seems like something that you would think would be all that controversial. And yet, he's killed for it, right? There's a huge uprising against him. The government is out to get him. There's a massive level of resistance. There are, of course, people that are on his side, people that are preaching his gospels. And that's so often true in the corporate world, in digital transformations or other kinds of transformations. You have some people who are passionate advocates and evangelists of this transformation, but very often the masses will rise up against it, or other powerful figures will rise up against that transformation, that change, because it's not in their interest. And I think that's a safe it's not much of a stretch to say just the historical story that's laid out in the story of Jesus pretty much tells that story. So I think that's another aspect of human psychology that we all need to be mindful of when we're leading, which is that idea of resistance. And then the last thing is this idea of renewal. And again, just thinking of it as a story is a little bit like the Joseph story, maybe even more extreme, right? Joseph is thrown into a pit. He's thrown into a dungeon. His life seems to be worthless. He has no future, and he manages to rise up to something far, far greater. And of course, the story of Jesus has Jesus actually literally being killed, one step beyond where Joseph is. I mean, he dies eventually, of course, but late in life after many accomplishments. And of course, the story of Jesus has him being killed and crucified, and then rising back up. And I think that again, religious scholars will probably have something more profound about it to say than I do. I'd like to believe that it's okay to see in these stories many, many different things that can be inspiring. So I'm not suggesting the entire story of Jesus or Noah or Moses or any of these is about corporate America. That's not my point, but only that there are things to be inspired by and to learn from in these stories. And I think that this idea of it's never over. It's never over. And, we see Toys R Us that went out of business, and they've come back. And I think now they're out of business again, if I'm not mistaken. But you never have to give up. You never have to consider that something is completely finished. If you have a vision of what you're trying to accomplish, that vision can resurface, can come back up, even if your company's bankrupt, even if your board turns against you, even if nobody's interested. Of course, it doesn't mean it will always be successful in the end, but you never have to choose to say, I'm defeated and it's over. You have always the opportunity to rise again and try again. And I think that's something that we've seen many, many businesses in the digital world, again, as I mentioned earlier in the story of Joseph, that have been challenged and floundered and had to go through multiple iterations to find success. And that I think is perhaps one flavor or one thread that one might take from the story of the Jesus coming back to life as part of the story of Easter. So those are my Bible. Well, thank you for coming to Howard's Bible study class today. Hope this has been interesting and helpful to you. And I'm sure you find many other meanings in all these stories. Feel free to put any comments that you like in the thread. If any other Bible stories that you think are important stories from a leadership perspective, and anything that you believe I've misspoken or missaid from a religious perspective, I give you my apologies, and also encourage you to correct me if I've misstated any of the meanings or you disagree with any of my interpretations of these stories. I love for these live casts to be a starting point for dialogue. So I perfectly welcome that, and I will look forward to reading any comments. And with that, I thank you for listening. I thank you for watching. Have a wonderful, holy, spiritual, meaningful holiday season for everybody who's celebrating, and I look forward to seeing you next time.